So again, this is a reminder, Shadrach Katu, sort of enterprise content management, electronic document management system expert who's sort of done these systems at places like the IMF and the Nelson Mandela Foundation and now at the International Atomic Energy Agency. As basically, as part of his dissertation research, has kind of tried to pull apart this, this economy and this subsector of the market apart to give us a way of understanding it. And so anything that has a asterisk SK is from him. Okay, so he sort of identifies that he says there are sort of phases by which this has transpired across time. The early phase was these electronic document management systems and the separate electronic records management systems. Then slowly we morph into a second phase, which is kind of integrating these things. So integrated document and records management systems and electronic documents and records management systems as sort of integrated systems. And if you remember in the Frank's book, she gave you some graphical representations about what those would look like in terms of what the application is, where the repository is, where the user interface is, and how they basically relate. And there's different architectural models for how this works. And then the final is sort of the, what I call, what did I say? Fortran ruled the roost, but Fortran is no longer ruling the roost. The ruling the roost now is really this thing called ECM, Enterprise Content Management, that include things like document management, records management, workflow, business process management, knowledge management, portal features, and on and on and on. So a much richer, more complicated piece of software that is struggling to manage what we call unstructured content. So what's the difference? What is the difference between structured content and unstructured content in the world that we're talking about? And I know this might not have been in the readings, but it's a really important concept. Can we let Rachel, do you want to answer anything?
Unstructured content doesn't have the meaningfulness. It's not organized in a way in which anybody can retrieve useful information, whereas the other provides different kinds of systems that allow people to have a consistent way of organizing information.
Yeah, it's sort of the bigger picture of it. Sarah?
Oh, sorry.
No, that was okay. That was just a pen up in the air. Okay, any hands? Yes.
One of the big separations is not the big ones you know with it.
I'm sorry?
I think one of the big separators is not the big ones, the metadata associated with it.
So Alex, which would be which?
Structured and metadata.
More formally, like visually apparent, kind of, or just existing?
This is some way that makes it searchable.
Okay, there's definitely some components there. We'll pull that apart a little bit further. Amy?
I mean, if we're thinking in terms of electronic context, structured data is machine searchable in a way that unstructured data is
Field searchable or specific searchable, right? Nope, not again? Okay. So structured data would be something that you'd see in like a database, right? So you have like a database, you have a data entry screen, a data input screen, right? Which would have sort of field labels. So I have like, you know, a data, so here's like say this is your computer screen, or this is a data entry screen for a record in a database. So you'd have like a field label and then a blank that you type in, and you may have like a pick list or a pull down menu or authorized forms you could put in. But that's structured. Things are living here in a very structured fashion, but they go in specific places. You can't put things here, down here kind of thing, right? Unstructured data would be what you would normally encounter as like documents that you produce on the computer. Spreadsheets, word processing documents, email messages, where even though we get into this language of genre and the way things should look, it's fundamentally unstructured. So the searching thing is true because you can search a database based upon fields, right? Formally, and that's a feature of it. But if you wanted to search, how would you search the unstructured document on your computer? Find, or Spotlight for a Mac, is that what it's called, Spotlight? And then what are you going to get when you search that unstructured data through Find or through Spotlight? What are you putting in? You're looking for like a word. So any instance of that word that appears anywhere on that hard drive in any document would be found. That has nothing to do with relevance or about the document, where if you could do this kind of field structured search, you can kind of say, I want the title equals, and that kind of gives you a sense. So all the kind of library catalog searching that you're doing and bibliographic database you're searching, that's kind of working with structured data. Unstructured data is this world that kind of arose out of the PC and the network era that we talked about, where people at their desktop can create unique kinds of documents in whatever form that they want using these productivity software tools like word processing or a spreadsheet or presentation software. So the things that you normally encounter at your computer that you're doing and producing, it's basically unstructured data. So what's the problem in organizations? Not so much the databases, it's the unstructured documents that are being produced at unbelievable levels of quantity. And so what's happening with these tools is that they are introduced as a way of trying to manage the unstructured data, all these documents going throughout the organization in a logical, coherent fashion through network environments, right? And so we can kind of tease this apart a little bit further with the electronic document management system. So you're familiar with all these things, but you're probably familiar with it as a name of a software tool you use, as opposed to, oh, this is my electronic document management system. So basically, these are software systems for storing digital documents in shared environments. So sometimes that could be mixed digitized paper, image paper, born digital documents, word processing documents, spreadsheet. The kind of things that they do, they store records, you can control them, and you can retrieve them. And so we see these things in like electronic publishing. There's a whole sort of series of industries, but can anyone think of a piece of software that they've used that kind of would qualify as this kind of electronic document management thing? And so this maybe make it a little clearer. So some of the functions that you could do, version control, right? Check-in and check-out control, meaning if you put something in a repository, you may have these problems with Google Drive or other things that you're using about someone takes a document out, they edit it, they put it back in, but before they put it back in, someone else takes the document out and does their editing, and then they throw it back in, and then that overwrites the one that the person just did, and then everyone gets mad at each other, right? Everyone familiar with this? So check-in and check-out control, some indexing with automated and user-entered metadata, so the metadata piece came up before. Storage in a repository, this notion that there's a repository where record documents are actually being dumped into, and allows for retrieval and certain security issues about permissions and logins and things like that. So is that more familiar? Anyone kind of familiar with a piece of software that they use that would you qualify that?
Yeah, the archive that Alex and I both worked in uses this, it's Artesia, they call it Teams for GN's media history. It just keeps track of all of this stuff. It's more in an archival sense at this point in time, so we use it for a lot of ads and old documents that they want to be able to reference.
Okay, but is it effective? Does it work? Is it good enough for what needs to get done there?
They're replacing it.
Just barely. But you have this notion that you have permissions to do certain things and not to do certain things. If someone takes something out, it's a checked out document, right? And about version control, and you have a repository that things are being sort of captured in, presumably. And the agreed is this is just a vessel. It doesn't mean that things are organized, because you have to deal with your foldering schemes. This is where the records management tools come in about having good classification schemes and having good rules about what goes in and what doesn't go in and who can do what kind of stuff. So I've been through multiple generations of these kinds of things. We have to do something here that Xerox put out called DocuShare. And so this would be a platform that people would use on research projects. And so, we need the proposal. We need to pull the proposal together. So there's drafts of the proposal, and you put who's allowed to see this and who's a part of this group. So maybe there might be some things that look familiar. If anyone had to operate at administrative level with C tools? No? It's some features of that, but that's more like a content management thing, right? So the other thing that kind of emerged that you read about was the records management application, right? So what does that do? That's different from documents. So don't look at this. So when you were reading about the records management application in the Frank's book and some of the other readings, what was the kind of sense that you got about why we see the emergence of this thing? Why aren't document management systems good enough for our purposes? Why do we need this separate animal called RMA, Records Management Application, Record Keeping Application, RKA? What's the problem that's occurring with electronic document? Even though it's good enough, but barely good enough, what's it not doing that we care about as records managers? Talk about it. Anyone ever use a records management application? Yes?
I mean, I've used like Jira, which is more ticketing.
Jira. Yeah, I don't think that would qualify. You're gonna become very familiar with Jira, actually, because when you do the SharePoint assignment, you want to, part of it is that as students, you're bashful about harassing SI computing with changes that need to occur, but this is one of the great things that will be kind of really great exercise is that as you work through SharePoint, you may encounter errors, you may find errors, and you would just submit a ticket, a Jira ticket that would go to SI computing, and they'd kind of resolve it, and then they'd let us know what changed and what happened. So that's, but no, kind of, not quite. Well, yeah, so this is actually quite interesting. Why, so you're very familiar with like C Tools and Wolverine Access, and what else is there? Google Docs. What else there you're using? What are the other productivity software tools that you're using?
So to what extent does it count as using records management stuff when we're entering our timesheet or entering student grades? Because it's going into something that's being managed, but we're not actually in
The
charge of
interface.
managing it.
Right, so that's the bigger piece of these enterprise content management. So Wolverine Access is, you could argue, is this large enterprise content management. Back when I started here, all these things were different systems, and a lot of these were paper processes. Then there was something called M-Pathways that came along, and it was a huge developmental project within software industries to kind of make organizations share information internally in a better fashion, not to deal with redundant information like your name appears once, and then every system that you appear in, it pulls from that, as opposed to you enter who you are here, and you enter who you are here, and you enter who you are here, and these are systems that don't talk about. So what happened is there's huge investment, and actually Washington Community College, about 15 years ago, spent $80 million on one of these things. Or maybe I'm exaggerating, maybe it wasn't 80 million, but it was pretty close. And what happened? They gave it up. It didn't work out so well, right? Why? Because, we'll just buy a piece of software and this will solve all our problems. You still have to do the hard work of information management. So what happened with document management? Document management was good in terms of sharing information and version control and helping people kind of be productive in terms of working together. And it was about collaboration. What it didn't do was some of the things that we care about as records managers, right? We want to understand records being different from non-records because we think records have these special attributes and qualities that need to be managed. And that's sort of a moving target right now, but that's sort of our Bible, our catechism, our canon is basically around this notion of records. Records is a specific kind of communication that serves as evidence of that communication, and we manage it to document those activities. So records are controlled by the organization. You declare something a record and you capture it, you freeze it. The notion that a record is unchangeable, unalterable, bless you. Whereas on document management, it's all about taking things and making new versions and kind of, adding things to it. It's a dynamic moving target where the record is kind of the stable thing that you don't want to be changed. It's the frozen record, basically, right? They also allow for more richer classification and organization that kind of feeds into some of the processes of records management. This notion of storage in a repository. So you can cite like attributes of document management in here. It's a little more security conscious about who can retrieve things and who can access things. But the key thing it does is that distinguishes it is that as you organize records, you can invoke what's called retention and disposition. Basically meaning is that you can actually classify records as having like a 5-year lifespan or a 3-year lifespan, and then they'll get destroyed under disposition guidelines. But a lot of those other tools aren't dealing with that. In fact, we have heard, I believe, this term from some of our peers here, that these systems that I'm using, they just build and build and build until there's nothing to do, and then we have to deal with it. Records management is all about how do you classify a document at the kind of the creations phase, file it appropriately, and it's filed in a place that links it with like documents that can be destroyed or kept over time. And then this notion that we're cognizant of what some of the statutory requirements are. The records management application impact is largely unknown. It's a youngish industry, maybe less than 15 years. It's recently been subjected to a lot of buyouts and consolidation under large actors. So you see, it's a classic thing you see with other applications that emerge in a kind of an entrepreneurial fashion. A lot of people trying to put a stake in the ground, building an application, want to draw kind of a market share to it. It's maybe successful. The big boys come in, they buy it, and you see a consolidation. So there used to be like 50 different range of these applications running around. This marketplace is kind of consolidated into a couple key players, such as IBM and HP. And it's now morphing into like a feature, function, or a module of enterprise content management systems. So some of the architectural views that you saw in the Frank's text about how we would relate the records piece to the document piece, to what degree are they separate, to what degree do we integrate them, and those kinds of things. So what we're looking at, SharePoint 2010 would be an example of a large enterprise content management system that embeds records management functionality within it. And it's interesting to see what can occur as records management within the native SharePoint environment, and then features about the kind of the external market that writes applications that work with SharePoint that maybe serves more records management. But we'll kind of get into this next week when we get into SharePoint. So another piece of this applications is that it understands records as sort of a strategic asset to the organization that needs to be managed, cognizant of the risks, where document management doesn't really kind of have that kind of awareness, right? It's an emphasis on things that we care about: authenticity, reliability, the integrity of the record, that it's not alterable, where a lot of the collaboration tools, it's all about changing documents rapidly fashion, right? It increases this, again, the retention disposition feature. But we're seeing a change in focus with some of these. And so this becomes, if you get nothing else from this class today, the key thing that's happening in this market is that we are really very proficient as a society with building software, but we're not necessarily very proficient at building software that is usable. And we tend to not put the user front and center. And so a lot of the things that you're seeing in other courses that you're being exposed to at SI about the user, it's really critical. We're just coming around to this concept of the user because our old ways of doing things weren't working. So when the first records management applications came out that were compliant with that DoD standard that Frank's talked about, it had required metadata elements. And so how would you add metadata to an email message to be compliant with this records management application, to be compliant with the law so it can be stored in the records repository? Oh, you had to fill out like 15 metadata forms on a profile sheet before you could file your email. How effective do you think that was when people were using this? What are you willing to do to file a document in a repository if it requires you to do this? Anyone ever do anything like this? Before you can do something to it, you have to fill out a profile sheet, right? So this was the solution. Yes, it resolved the document versus records management challenge. It demonstrated compliance with the record-keeping statutory framework that we had to deal with. But at the end of the day, it was unusable. So what did users do? They didn't use it. What do we now need? What do we now have determined is that users will click maybe 2 or 3 clicks at the most to file something in an appropriate place. They won't fill out a profile sheet. They won't type in all this metadata. So that's infeasible. So the records management applications worked to the extent that they dealt with the issue on a kind of intellectual level. But in terms of actually providing a tool that people can actually use and make sense of and be willing to use, it was a complete failure, right? And so when you look at the MOREC is about, well, it's about breaking records management into these like component parts and services. It doesn't all have to be in this giant system, right? The other thing, yes, our good old friend enterprise content management. Currently ruling the roost. And so anyone familiar with any enterprise content management systems you might encounter? Well, let me define it for you first. Okay, so what it does, it integrates things that are previously standalone. So document management application, records management application, right? So we're seeing those as separate pieces of software that you buy and install, and they supposed to interleaf with each other. Email management on top of that, right? So you have email application, but you want an email application, but that sits separate from your document management. You can't put your documents and your email together. You can't identify email records and then put them in a record management system necessarily because you're in Outlook. How do you export something out of Outlook? Well, you can export something out of Outlook, but it kind of loses some of its native functionality as an email message, right? Deals with some workflow and some collaboration issues. So AIM, the Enterprise Content Management Association, right? So now AIM, Enterprise Content Management Association. It used to be the Association of Information and Image Management. Is all about micrographics, but now they're the content management. So we have a whole legacy professional association that is now calls itself the Enterprise Content Management Association, which has amazing content on it. It's a great website. They define ECM for us. They call it, and Frank's kind of reinforced this, the technologies used to capture and manage and store and preserve and deliver content and documents related to organizational processes. They are the tools and strategies allow the management of an organization's unstructured information wherever that information exists, right? So all these things are all over the organization, all these machines, and we want to basically figure out how do we effectively capture, manage, store, preserve, and deliver. Not all of these things are strictly records pieces. So instead of having this very heavy, onerous records management application that we sit on top of all these other applications, what's emerging is these enterprise content management, which, by the way, can introduce records management functionality as a feature of the software as opposed to like a separate tool. So this is like a complex moving target that's actually happening right now. So Mr. Katu has given us a way of thinking about what is enterprise content management. So he says you have it, and it's sort of things that you may kind of be exposed to as separate systems, right? Web content management. Anyone know anyone familiar with any web content management systems? WordPress, Drupal, exactly. Digital rights management, we're on publishing, right? Digital asset management. Anyone familiar with the digital asset management world? What are you familiar with?
From my internship at the Smithsonian, sort of the final place for everything is the digital asset, the dams.
Dams. And what was stored in the dams?
All of the metadata.
Okay.
And I think both the preservation and the access copies of materials.
So, but content as well, right?
Yeah.
And these tend to be like large image files or moving image files. So digital assets, basically a lot of, and this is like a Hollywood thing, like, everything's digital right now, and they're producing, they want to reuse code and things like that. They store what they consider the information objects are not just things to make the organization run more efficiently. They're seen as the assets of the organization, and they need to manage them as assets. And so this becomes a feature of enterprise content management. Knowledge management, everyone's still trying to see, well, is this a real thing or not? But it has some elements of that. Some portal aspects in terms of providing like a single interface to lots of different resources, imaging, collaboration tools, workflow. Here we are, records management, we're part of it in document management. So all these things sort of cycle around this bigger beast called enterprise content management. Anyone think of any examples from U of M that doesn't necessarily do all this, obviously, but kind of would be, you could characterize as an enterprise content management system?
Would C-Tools or Wolverine Access?
I think Wolverine Access is sort of the best example at the university of what we're talking about, right? Payroll, employment, benefits, grades, enrollments. I can go and I could do everything from my own health benefits to looking at the roster of this class, right? It's all through one gateway. I get in there, I authenticate one time in, so I don't have to authenticate through multiple systems. I have to authenticate in one system, and I have access to all this stuff, basically. Okay, and so the way that we kind of try to think about this is think about it through implementation phases, right? So there's the pre-selection phase, there's the selection and installment phase, and then there's the post-installment phase. So this is kind of like how you go about identifying what you need a system to do, what systems out there do what you're asking it for, then selecting the one that you want. So some of the stuff that you're doing around business analysis is kind of part of that. Technological analysis, what's the hardware, software infrastructure? So if we do buy a big piece of software, what's our operating system? What's our processing? What's our server? What kind of operating systems are our servers running on? Do we need to buy a special server because some software needs special servers to deal with only with its own content? And so you need to understand, well, if we're going to buy something and we're going to spend like tens of thousands of dollars or whatever it is, how much do we want to connect it to what we have, our existing hardware, software, our existing hardware infrastructure and capabilities, and to what degree would picking something mean that we need to basically buy a whole new range of technological devices, basically. So degree to which we'd sort of have something that's integratable versus something that sort of replaces a lot of things. So thinking through that, and I think the JISC InfoNet kind of is a methodology to think through some of these pieces if you looked at that document a little carefully. Then you have the selection. So understanding, again, some of the user requirements, the tender, this is the English South African way of saying putting out a call for proposals, RFP tenders, and then selecting it, and then instituting rolling out. And then this is really critical, right? Most people say, oh, we'll buy it, we'll install it, and then our job is done. Well, actually, no, your job's not done. Your job hasn't even actually begun. Actually, all the hard work goes. And then you want to kind of understand does it actually provide the value to the institution that you think it would. So this is just another way of thinking these things as cycles. You just don't go buy something. You have to do a lot of heavy hauling before you actually get to that point. And then once you get there, you still have a long way to go. Another way of thinking about this, these phases, pre-selection phase, the selection phase, and the post-installation phase is like connecting it to some of the documents that I had you look at, as well as the larger corpus of electronic records management standards and guidelines, right? And so the JISC InfoNet document I had you look at kind of helps you think through some of the pre-selection phases. If you look at the stages 1 through 5 of that document, it kind of helps you think through some of the things you need to kind of attend to while you're in the process of determining what is the best kind of system. And then selection installation is sort of what are some of the functional requirements that we want for this system. And so the MOREC model helps with some of that. The ICA standard we read earlier on in the term helps with that. The DoD one, which you kind of got a little hint at from Frank's, is part of that. Other stages of the JISC InfoNet document. And then finally, the post information, again, the JISC InfoNet. So that's why I kind of profiled that report for you to read, because it kind of gets at the different phases that you need to attend to with these are large, complex projects, right? So we're talking about it, but if you would actually do this for your job, this is what you would be doing full time for well over a year, right? So part of what we want you to understand is the bigger picture, but what this would mean to you is this is what you would do day in and day out, walking through these multiple complex steps, maybe taking advantage of these. The point is that, and I know, okay, so when you read these documents, so you read the Ireland one, you read the MOREC one, you read the ICA one, what do you come away from that with? How does that make you feel reading these documents? It's like, I never want to do this for the rest of my life, or like, what does it make? They're confusing, like, what the hell would I do with this thing? I mean, what do you get out of those things when you go through them? And fire away.
I just don't know how I'd remember it all. Like, I like a checklist.
The first thing is that That's the first thing about these. You do not have to remember them. They are reference documents you turn to use. That's the first thing. Okay. What else? How else do they make you feel?
I feel like a lot of them say very explicitly, this is not an implementation guide. These are
Yes.
the high,
Help you think through.
yeah, so these are things you should be concerned about, but you will have to figure out how it actually applies to your particular
Yes.
business, which is all very well and good, and then you have to figure out how it actually applies.
Right, that's called punting, right? Well, how else do they make you feel when you read these things? Or your reactions to even browsing them? Remember the ISO 15489 early in the semester? Remember reading that? How did that make you feel? Utterly confused. But it's cradle to grave, right? It's comprehensive coverage of everything that you would need to factor in for a records management application. So the key point about why you read these documents is not that you have to remember them, that they're tools for you to use to help you understand and think through the issues associated with electronic records and these large complex systems that are being built. So the idea is not, and a lot of them are seen as infeasible, overly complex, overwrought, and I think the MOREC has kind of learned those lessons from the early iterations. They're trying to do a different approach to that. But the key thing about these documents is that they are resources for you to turn to help you visualize, think through, understand what the issues. Because if you just sit down with a blank piece of paper, you're going to be lost. The kind of, think of it as like an orienteering, like a compass in a way. And it's not that you have to satisfy all the requirements. It's not that they're easily implementable, but it gives you a sense of the landscape of the issues that you need to kind of factor in and concern yourself with as you deal with some of these larger systems, basically. And what are they used for, right? They have a couple of uses. So what are some of the uses they say that some of these tools are used for? You just read a couple. I'm so kind. I didn't make you read all of them. So they're used for who? Who are they targeted towards? Who are they trying to communicate with?
A lot of them are good for businesses.
Like developers to create software, right, that meet, so the DoD standards, if you want to sell a piece of software to the US, you have to comply with this. So this is like actually like a guideline for developers who want to build applications and sell it to the government and presumably make some money out of that, right? So that's one target. Who else might they be targeted to?
With the example of the Australian functional requirements, you talked a lot about how that was engineered to share documents from the government with the public.
Right, so part of it is that these are public institutions, so they need to sort of consult with the public. So that's why that thing I got you earlier, the exposure draft for digital archiving, migration plans and things like that. So part of it is speaking to potential users, right? But you know, the users ever going to want to read these things? The other audience is like the records managers, right? And the information managers in the organization to understand what is it that makes records and records management different than a broader concept of information management or records management as a feature, this bigger thing we talked about early in the semester called information governance. So that's how I want you to understand these tools. Understand what they're useful for and how you might, who they're targeted towards and what their strengths and limitations are. The goal is not that you're going to go and be able to speak out of your mouth about what all these standards are and all the features and functions of them. They're kind of things you turn to as you try to grapple with some of these challenges, right? Another way of thinking about this trajectory is by looking at how the timeline. So what are we talking about? The first DoD standard is like 15, 16 years ago. MOREC's been through 1, 2, 3 versions. The JISC-InfoNet is pretty recent. The ICA is also pretty recent. We don't care about the tenders. But what are you seeing? You're seeing in a relatively short period of time, really over the last decade, an incredible proliferation of these standards and guidelines speaking to issues of electronic document management, electronic records management, and giving you things about metadata, retention, classification, and so on and so forth. But what you can kind of see, we're in this kind of compressed zone right now where a lot of these documents are coming up because we see this rapidly moving software market around content management and trying to figure out how the records management piece fits into this. So that's a pretty interesting way of taking what we talked about. We took a little bit of historical view earlier this class. Now we're seeing that what we're talking about to manage these complex content that's being heterogeneous, unstructured throughout the organization and all these different applications is really strong efforts to try to develop guiding documents to help think through how records management can fit into these. So that's another thing they're doing. But the other thing is that none of these provide a solution for you. They're kind of things that you have to work through to kind of make sense of. So that's the hard part and kind of like the cop-out part in a way around that. Talked a little bit about this, but this is a really important document to help you think through that and help you think through a purchasing and implementing an electronic document records management system that they say is free from vendor bias and specific to the needs of financial, like the higher education industry. But it's a, quote, a proven methodology that provides you with a checklist, you like checklists, checklist of tasks and a logical sequence in which to complete them. So again, some of those things give you the big picture, but they don't tell you how to function and how to operate. This gives you like an operational plan that you would apply some of these other documents to help you think it through. So this is like a staged approach about the different features that you would need to attend to in sequential order, right? And so what are some of the things we're seeing here? Project management, you know, all those group projects that you're doing and foundations. This is like, and the hilarious thing is over and over again when they talk about what are the skills that records managers need today, some of the things that you're getting that are ancillary to the course, and sometimes you're concerned about why are we doing this, they're kind of being seen in the marketplace as the key skills that they're looking. You can read, you can write well, you can communicate, you can run a meeting, you can manage a project and deadlines, you can do some process analysis, you can make a case on something, business case, understanding requirements, how you might go about procuring. Obviously, you don't do all these things at SI, but the bigger picture is that some of the stuff that's at SI, that the bigger picture outside of records management are being seen as directly relevant to this mission. So the ICA is another one of these documents, basically guiding principles and implementation issues. So again, it's kind of a mix of both of them, kind of like what are the principles from like the high level records management piece, but then what are the things that need to do around the implementation phase? And so what do you need to consider around implementation? So part of it is like procurement, part of it is implementation, and part of it is the post-implementation review. These documents help you pull those elements apart of kind of like the purchasing and use life cycle, if you want to call it that. And then finally, the MOREC around this concept of services. So this is another thing, and that was the other kind of case study I had you read, looking at this notion of records managers is not providing technologies and not providing platforms for information management or records management, is thinking about it from a service model, providing services to organizations. So it's a very different way of thinking about it, right? And so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because I do want to get us into this discussion here. Okay, right, so regardless of how you're doing it, COT2 reminds us that you need to address critical issues. What's your infrastructure? What are you trying to do with this thing? And how people fit in. And then a really good citation with the URL on the next slide is understanding the role of organizational culture. Different cultures have different ways of working. You need to be sensitive and attuned to that. That's the thing that we're seeing with the failures that we saw in the health records management systems and the news stories, right? They're not taking this kind of approach to building these systems. They're just building systems and expecting people to adapt to them. You build a system and expect people to adapt to them. They'll hate it, and they may not use it, and the stakes are so high right now. So the SI approach is thinking about these bigger contingencies and how they relate, but really thinking about the people piece, which is always the missing piece. So records managers now are starting to think more about the people piece as opposed to building a piece of software that does everything records managers want to accomplish, thinking about how people actually work and what you can expect. So we moved away from the metadata profile sheet and moved more towards trying to how can we capture some of the metadata naturally, organically, without or through clicks, as opposed to unrealistic typing in a lot of crap into a profile sheet that no one does anyway. Some resources. Oh, this is great, right. So the bigger marketplace is Gartner, Forrester, and the real story. I'm just going to blast through this right now. these are independent market analysis, right? So they'll test software. It's kind of like consumer reports for these kind of applications, right? And they sell these reports for like $8,000, $10,000. So, you know, big Fortune 500 companies do this. But they do this, and they look at the ECM market, and they analyze the ECM market. They make judgments on strength and maturity of the applications. So this is something you really need to kind of understand if you're turning to this in your job in a couple of years. Oh, I have all these great standards from records management class I took, but what's happening in the marketplace now? What are the applications now? It's a moving target. This is never going to stabilize. It's always going to be a moving target. These consultancies can help you get a feel. And so what they do is they produce some of these documents, right? So one produces the magic quadrant, right? Between the ability to execute and the completeness of the vision. So if you're down here, you're not doing too good. If you're up here, you're kind of like the market leaders, right? So this gives you a sense. They do all these metrics and measures about where are people standing, right? Who's a niche player? Who's a visionary? Who's a challenger? Who's a leader? So the challenges may be coming, but right now they're letting you know that if you're out there and you want like a stable, kind of well-established application that is at the top of the marketplace, these are the ones. And they have a whole background report to that. The other one is I like the wave. Let's do the wave. The forest, the wave. Forest is another one of these. So they have something like current offering. Is it weak or is it strong? These are kind of the metrics that they come up with, right? Is it weak or is it strong around strategy? Is it weak around its current offering? Strategy means like what is the plans for this down the road? And they give you the sense of the market presence. And so here you have the same things, but you know, different ways of thinking about it. Leaders, strong performers, contenders, which basically means losers, I guess, is contender. I don't know. But here you have the same thing. So the idea would be, can you take these two things and are there comparisons? Are they relatively seeing the same thing and make it, are they coming up with similar findings? And roughly they are kind of coming up with similar findings, but they're separate, independent evaluators of these tools and doing they're really working these tools and trying to break them and see what the capabilities are. And then they write these reports that they then sell for lots of money. But you can kind of get, what's the word? Voyeuristically get access to these things through like stuff on the web and news stories, because these things will come out and you could find like what the basic things they're saying, but you don't have to spend $10,000 for the whole report, unless you work for a very big company that was willing to spend that kind of money. And so, yeah, example. So here's the Gartner and Forrester, where they're lying. So you can see they're basically aligned here in terms of like Microsoft is here, SharePoint's here, but SharePoint's here, category A in terms of like, leaders, emergent, and the other, and what categories. So basically, they're basically confirming that they're all kind of agreeing roughly what are the leaders at this point. And then finally, I love this. This is another way. So these are all the content management, document and records management, it's kind of like a New York City subway map. But you can kind of get a feel for how these all relate and what they do. So if all these systems are coming at you, what the hell are they? How do they relate? This is one way of thinking about, and this is the real story group. This is the third. So there's Gartner, Forrester, and the real story. This is how they kind of graphically visualize what this market is between digital marketing technology, collaboration, and social software. So Google Docs is right here, basically. And again, it's just another way of understanding this market landscape. So all that being done, we have about a half an hour right now, and I kind of want to turn to this. But the bigger point that I wanted to get with these previous slides is that it's a moving target, it's a complex target, records managers are producing their own standards and guidelines, application developers and software developers, these large corporations develop their own software, and to what degree are they kind of talking to each other? These kind of market research and understanding like who Gartner is and what they do, what Forrester is and what they do, and what Real Story is and what they do can kind of help you get a handle on this landscape. Where otherwise you just kind of dropped in the ocean and you see this application, what the hell is this? How does it relate to other things? These give you ways of thinking through that. And then, then you have to think about how much budget you have and all that other kind of stuff. So let's turn to the case studies that you had to read to get a feel for some of the stuff we've been talking about might be intuitive. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, about 7 minutes each on these. And so the first one was Hettonen and Kettunen, functional classification of records and organizational structure. That's Amy, Sarah, and Alex. So Author. Okay, well, I can do that part. We'll call it H and K. H and K N-E-N, because that's the name. Okay, so what's the context of this?
Government agency.
Finish. Finish, 2 N's, government agency. And so not all of these will apply to every case, but let's kind of walk through it. Okay, so the Finnish government agency, they're trying to, what are they trying to do with this case study?
With the case study or with the system?
I'm sorry, with the system, yeah. Well, the system, the case study kind of explains what they were trying to do with the system, right?
They're trying to implement a kind of automatic, functional, keeping track of records in terms of the functional analysis and
Yeah.
tracing, which of the workers in the agency is using which kind of functional analysis, and if they can kind of, I think the big picture is that they want to sort of improve automatic metadata collections. They want to kind of make it easier to keep track of who's doing what and what kind of disposition they can put on these various records. And to do that, they're doing research on who's creating what kind of records and how are they keeping track of these records. Yes.
Yeah.
And is there like a problem that they're trying to overcome? Why are they doing this?
Well, that's actually something that I have a question about it.
Yeah.
Because the people doing the study acknowledged that they implemented the system and that they were trying to use the system to kind of sort things.
Uh-huh.
I didn't feel like they touched on how well it was or was not working. They just kind of pointed out some things that were working and some things that weren't.
Okay, so you found this like unsatisfying in that regard?
Yes.
Okay, well that's okay too, because these are different cases that we're trying to kind of look at. So, did they identify barriers to doing this?
A lot of the classes they were using to identify records to automate metadata were underused. I mean, they're only using 20% of the available identifiers or classes that you could use. And that was only a handful of the upper level employees. The lower level ones were only using very small handfuls. So very unequal distribution in how the system can.
Okay, so barrier would be lack of consistency on the user part, right? Lack of consistent use. That means if you're trying to get everyone to do the same thing, presumably that will benefit the system because basically everything should live where it lives, but they're finding inconsistent use around this system, right? Now, why are they finding that inconsistent use? Why is the use inconsistent?
To some extent, it depends on the role of the person who's using the system. So they find the administrative users are using all of these different functional categories, whereas someone who's doing something very limited is using just one or two.
Okay, but
they
that's,
also have some people use it a lot, and some people use it very little. So it's also the organizational culture that's not meshing with
Yeah.
it.
There was a lack of guidance as to how to use it.
okay, so this is a really kind of important measure. And so would you say it's an issue of training? Did they discuss the training dimension to this? Did they train people in this system or how to use it? Or how did they illuminate on that at all?
They talk about it at the conclusion that training would be a good idea, but they don't discuss.
Okay, so they roll out the system with all these complex categories. They want people to kind of pick the right category for what they're doing, but they don't train them on how to do it?
Well, it appears that they did train them because at one point they mentioned that this is how they would use like a tag, but they also mentioned that sometimes one tag might mean one thing in one classification unit and the same exact tag will exist in another one, it means something different.
Right, so is that a design issue or is that a user training issue? Or a little bit of both? Or it's unclear?
They didn't really specify. I think part of the problem in the case was that everything had to be so anonymous that they couldn't really
Yeah.
get into details about much of anything.
Okay, fair enough.
You sort of had to decide for yourself as to what was a problem there, it seems.
Okay. Now, did you notice any success factors? Did they promote any success? Oh, it's used.
By some people, just people who use it, they say use it a lot.
And so why were some people using it and other people weren't using it?
It's actually something they discussed. They said that some people might have been, because part of the study, they said that midway through this study, the company was restructured. And so they said
Okay, and did they, when the organization got restructured, did the records?
They said the organization was restructured, but they said that the functions remain the same, so the
Yes.
system remains the same.
So this is a classic thing that we talk about over and over again in the archives field in the coursework here. Organizations will always change. They will change what they call themselves, how they call themselves in organizational charts. What doesn't change as rapidly is what they do. So the approach is to understand what we do and use that as the approach for thinking about how we name and classify things as opposed to what's in this office at this point in time. So the point that we move towards function is that functions change, but they don't change as rapidly as the names by which we call them, the units in organizations. So if we can develop a functional approach, even if the organization changes, basically the functions aren't going to change. So the labels for the functions are pretty stable. So that'll help with consistency of information management across time. So use, and then did you see a key implementation issue emerging around this?
Well, no, I mean, they also say, in terms of what can we do with what we've learned, you know, you could create these user profiles that would help to do this automatic metadata creation and help with interaction with the system. And yes, building systems that guide users interacting with the system. Yeah, so basically, they want to implement sort of specifics for the different roles that users can have that will help in the various ways.
Okay, so I'll just call that what I like to call the El Cibola of automatic classification. Does anyone know what El Cibola was? All those conquistadors running around, what were they looking for? The city of gold. Did they ever find the city of gold? Not really. So it's this sort of like mythic thing that, you know, with records management right now, it's all about automatic classification, automatic. The machines will do it because we can't rely on the people to do it. And so we'll keep pushing there, but we're not quite there yet. Any final comments on this case?
I have a question.
Yes?
So they do talk about how, like, if someone uses, like, a functional class, that they're more likely to continue using that same one. But wouldn't the guides that they're saying would solve that, basically just ensure that I would only ever use these functional classifications, because that's what you're giving to me, and that's all I know?
Well, this is a really important thing. So when you have a database, so the analogy that I would make, you have a database structure, and say you have 100 fields. You can say, well, these are fields that the catalogers use, these are the fields that the indexers use, these are the fields that the analysts use. There's some overlap, of course, but there's unique things. You don't show everyone everything. You give them the partial view of what's relevant to them. And it sounds like what you're saying is that they're giving them everything as opposed to the partial view that's directly relevant to them. That goes back to the thing with the medical records, where you're seeing everything as opposed to what's most pertinent or relevant to what you're actually doing at that point in time, which means there's cognitive overload, which means it causes problems around consistent use and things like that.
So it's kind of the idea that you're going to be limited in what you can know anyways, but if they limit what they give you, you're going to have a better understanding. So if there's a term outside of that that might be relevant,
Well, maybe,
it's better to...
I would say not better understanding. The goal would be better organization and classification of the records that they do deal with would be the way that I would think about it. Well, let me jump ahead to the next one here. So Gunnlaugsdatter, Gunnlaugsdottir. Okay. And this is going to be Anna, Shay, Kimberly, and Colleen. So let's start with, we got the context. What's the context?
Iceland.
Iceland.
8 different organizations in Iceland.
Okay, so, and what kind of organizations?
They
Right.
have, like, a city organization, financial institute, public services office.
Okay. Okay, that's cool. I like that. So 8 different sectors, 8 different sector organizations in Iceland. And they talk about some of the barriers that they encountered in these 8 different sectors. What were some of the barriers that they encountered?
The researchers were looking into barriers of user-friendliness, insecurity of employees using computers, feelings about being monitored by management, and also feelings regarding like having their work seen by other coworkers.
Okay, so I'm putting down as user-friendliness, surveillance, and exposure. But I think there was a second one in there I missed.
Feelings of insecurity about using computers, just like uncomfortable
Okay.
skill level, I guess.
Sort of IT, what? IT anxiety. Okay, that's a lot of barriers. Now, were those barriers across these places, or did they find common ones, or these are like serial ones, or?
A common one is actually education and where you were in the company. If you were higher up or part of records management, chances were you would have a lot less trouble using the records management system. But if you didn't have that education, you didn't have that exposure, you were more suspicious of it and of everyone's intentions.
Okay, so sounds like a training thing in a way. So did any of them identify critical success factors or critical factors that made some contexts work better than others?
So if people were trained properly, and actually if they were part of developing a classification system, it seems like they were more willing to use the system. People were, I think what they found is that people were blaming their not using the system based on it not being user friendly, but then the research pointed to the fact that user friendliness was linked to training actually. So
Okay.
they did find it user friendly eventually.
Well, that's actually very interesting if you think about it, right? So your degree by which you think this system is usable is contingent upon whether or not they've actually invested in showing you how to use this system, basically. Any other success factors that you were witnessed in these cases that made a positive difference for their implementation?
They listed support by top management.
Okay, yep. Have you read that before this semester? Support by top management? You're probably getting tired of hearing that, but yeah, that's a critical issue that happens over and over again. How do you get top management interested? If you can get support from top management, that can really facilitate a successful implementation, because when the boss tells you it's important and they want you to do it is more actionable than if the records manager tells you it's important and they want you to do it, right? So think about who your allies are, what strategy you're approaching, right? How you want to approach getting people kind of invested in working with this.
Other thing I think
I'm sorry?
the other thing is that the ERMS has to fit the culture of the organization for it to be successful.
And so if you were to unpack that statement, like what does that mean, basically? Like how does the software fit the culture of the organization?
So like if people in the organization were part of like building a classification scheme, they would use a vocabulary that they're comfortable with
Okay.
instead of it being kind of like a foreign language.
Right, so it's not something that's like dumped on them, it's something that they are invested in because so that would be a culture of what? A culture of collaboration, a culture of sort of decision-making, not so hierarchical, it's more of like a flatter decision-making, kind of wider decision-making possibilities or wider contributions, as opposed to like what we see with these health systems. We're gonna buy it, we're gonna institute it, oh, and by the way, maybe you'll like it and maybe you'll hate it, but we didn't think to ask you. Any other barriers or success factors that you noted across these 8 cases that were particularly like salient to you? Oops. So dollars becoming important. And then finally, if you had to were you able to determine what you might consider a key implementation issue that maybe cut across a number of these cases where there's something that came up over and over again?
Lack of
Training.
training. Yeah, if people aren't comfortable with it, they're not going to use it.
Now-
An example of where they done a follow-up study and one organization that had done more training, like all their complaints of user friendliness had disappeared and CPs had jumped from like 15% to 50%.
So why is that? You encounter a new piece of software. What is it? It's unfamiliar. You don't know how to use it. The more that you have familiarity with it, it's like language. It's like using any piece of software you ever used. I don't understand this. This is foreign to me. once you become familiar with it, it becomes second nature, right? So think about when you first use seat tools here. With seat tools, it's kind of intuitive. But the thing is, now you can do seat tools probably with your eyes closed, right? But when you first got here, it was like a little, or Wolverine Access and doing a paycheck. Anyone do a paycheck in Wolverine Access? Or try to put their hours in? That's really easy, right? Okay, so training. Okay, let's do the last two now. Wilkins, Swatman, and Hulk. And Holt, and that's Mark, Sophia, and Gabrielle. So the human side of ERMS, achieved intangible benefits, lesson learned from a landmark EDRMS implementation. So what's the context? So Australian government agency. Like, did they talk about what kind of agency or? Okay, so we're basically talking a public sector agency in Australia. Okay. What was some of the barriers that they identified? Oh, but they'll get a little bit more about. So what were they trying to do with this software?
They wanted to make records available online, and that included a lot of transferring from paper records to digital.
So digitization, so it was a conversion project on one level, and then put them in a common repository with the born digital materials, basically. So you don't have a mixed system, it's all kind of together.
This way they were actually following current legislation, because before there was so much that was coming in that they weren't actually following the rules.
So they weren't complying with their own statutory requirements. And why did this become a problem? Like, was this something that became a problem, they addressed it, or this something that they prospectively saw would be a problem?
Well, the U.S. had passed a law that was one of the things that encouraged them.
There weren't any formal standards for record keeping that they could follow, so it was sort of exploring new territory.
Okay, so if you had to kind of identify a barrier or barriers that you saw, one was kind of connected to what you just commented upon. So what were some of the barriers of kind of getting this instituted in a meaningful way?
Lack of institutional standards for record keeping.
Okay, barriers is, so let's call that a poor record-keeping culture. Is that a fair statement? And actually, now that we think about some of these other cases, like how many of you, for the others, would say a poor record-keeping culture was some of the things that was actually hampering? Hard to say?
I don't think that was.
Okay. Any other barriers that you witnessed?
Well, going along with that, they were cognizant of the fact that there could be marginal support, or that records management isn't something that's necessarily highly regarded.
Right.
So with that in mind, they worked with this government, so they actually did a very good job working with that.
Okay, so low image or understanding of so low image that records management has in most organizations, as well as a poor understanding by these entities about what records management is and why it's important to them, or should be, or might be.
And I believe the biggest thing was that having to define what a record was the big thing.
Okay, so basically, so that would kind of connect to the poor understanding of records management, basically. Did they achieve any kind of success that they could point to, or that they pointed to? Did they feel good at the end of this?
And they call it landmark,
Landmark, oh, right, I'm sorry, yeah, the landmark. So what was some of the success factors?
They recognized immediately that the creators of the software would have to collaborate with the users right from the get-go, so that it's a functional piece of software.
Okay, so user involvement. And it wasn't not involvement in the purchasing, but involvement in what aspect would you say?
Those who would be using the software, it was designed to make it easier for them, and
Okay, so basically these are just containers, right? These software don't do anything on their own. You still have to develop your what's a record, what's not a record, what's your classification plan, what's your retention and disposition for specific content. So all this software does, it's like Word and having a document, having an assignment due. Word isn't going to do anything for you for that assignment. You still have to figure out the hard work of doing the work and the reading to produce the document to hand in, basically, right? So it's the same thing, it's the same analogy, maybe not imperfect analogy, but a similar analogy wherein the software in and of itself can do these things, but you need to implement it. And you need to, if you want people to manage information in a particular way, you have to basically give them, here's our series, or here's our folder classification scheme, or here's how you identify what a record is. And so you have to do that component, the hard work of actually what the management would look like, and then kind of embed it in the software. Software itself, and this is the common mistake that a lot of early records management applications in the government, US government determined, is that people thought a records management application will give us records management. No. A records management application will give you the capability to conduct records management, but you still have to do records management about what's a record, what's not a record, what's your classification scheme, where things will live, what the training is. And so these tools are only that. They're just tools. They don't make things happen on their own. So it's the hard, heavy hauling of face-to-face, engaging users, thinking about the culture that you're in is really the hard work that you have to do. So user involvement, any other key ones that came out?
Yeah, they did a lot of, so they did do the training that you talked about.
Okay.
They had like a switch day, I believe, so there were people specifically there to help people during that time.
Okay.
So they really took into consideration.
So it wasn't just like a one-off training, right? This was kind of like more of a persistent training to kind of, it's like, oh, we'll do an hour and then you go off. It's more like, didn't they shadow people too in that one?
They had people like in the offices, as like they call them like floor walkers or something.
Yeah.
Whenever someone had an issue.
And the overview is that people trained in this system are more likely to get hired by other local governments.
Okay. And then finally, the key implementation issue. If you had to pick one. Training? No? Maybe? Is that
They sounded very positive about it.
okay?
The thing that they kept talking about the most, it seemed to me, was talking about the process of digitization, converting from paper to online.
Okay, so they don't want mixed systems. They want it all in one place. Okay, so I'm sorry. Let's jump ahead because we're down to the last couple cases. I just want to. So Venire. What's the context? So this is Franny, Stephanie, Nicole, and Ortal, who's not here. Okay. So Franny, Stephanie, Nicole. What's the context?
This wasn't as much a traditional case study.
It was more like synthetic or something.
Right, it's very hypothetical, kind of.
But they're saying they're offering you a practical approach,
Right.
presumptively, right? Okay, so the context doesn't
Yeah.
really fit.
He's from New Jersey,
Okay, so
so he's in the US.
okay. Well, I'm not making any comments on New Jersey here, okay? Very fond of New Jersey. Okay, so barriers. Do they identify? This is like common things that they're seeing across cases that are barriers?
Well, I did remember, like, when I read it, they were saying, like, the business and the management departments were, like, really interested in this new technology, and other people were warning them against it, and they just went ahead with it. So I saw that as a, like, reason why things, like, didn't go so well.
Okay.
The hypothetical he sets up is IT picks the tool, gives a flashy presentation. The CEO is completely on board with them, and you're the records manager. How do you make what they picked work or convince them to choose something else?
And that, the thing is that's interesting. It's a theoretical case, blah, blah, blah. But this connects so tightly with what we saw around the electronic health record systems, right? It's the same exact thing, basically. And it's happening right now in real time with billions of dollars being spent.
The tips he gave were so practical, and they make some of the best practices so much less scary sounding.
Okay.
It's
Okay.
like, I'm like, okay, real people can do this.
So barriers.
Lack of tool testing, so they didn't test the tool before they decided to implement it.
Okay.
They didn't really define the needs beforehand.
They didn't do the pre-implementation work. They just bought something. And so the thing that Katu kind of indicated to us, these 3 phases, right? They didn't do the first phase. Or they didn't say that they even did the second phase. But they certainly didn't do any kind of thoughtful analysis about what it is that what their organizational setting is, their information architecture, infrastructure. And so they did no pre-implementation kind of analysis, basically, it sounds like to me. Okay. Okay. Did they identify any success? Were there any success factors? Or no, it's more like not in this case. What did they say? What did they say normally?
Things that you should do
Yeah.
as sort of the records manager in that situation is, basically invite yourself to every IT meeting and make sure that just nag at them so they're hearing your perspective. Know the business processes backwards and forwards so that you at least have a handle on what is needed. And then, a lot too with the implementation, do focus groups with users, even if things sound really dumb, I think the button should be on the other side of the screen, take them seriously because ultimately buy-in is about them liking the system.
Right. User buy-in. And we see that over and over again in a lot of these cases. But this is classic, right? So records managers, you could do one thing. You could just kind of stay in your office, focus on building, retention schedules, other stuff. The more fun thing is to actually go and talk to people in the organization. And so it's about building relationships and building credibility in your organization. You're only going to build credibility in your organization by building relationships and being available and talking to people. If you just kind of hide away, forget it. No one's going to listen to you. And yeah, you do have to kind of be a little bit of a pain in the ass, and you do have to be a little bit of a kind of, oh, I want to go to that meeting too. But the thing is, once you start showing yourself as being a reasonable person to go to help through it, you'll get asked, basically. But you have to build, I call it the campaign. It doesn't happen overnight. You have to build relationships over time. And then finally, the key implementation issue, if there was one.
Because of the way it was set up, there wasn't a real implementation, but one of the really interesting implementation ideas that he had is he kind of gives a step-by-step of how to pick units to test the new software first, how to assess their success using the software, how to move from, it worked in these 6 units to applying it to a whole business.
Right, so start small
Right.
and build out. Okay.
He also suggested after doing testing or reports to see what were the top searches and keywords and what were the top records that people were most frequently trying to find.
Generating a monthly report on use figures and search terms.
Okay, so Bill, drawing intelligence out of how people are actually using the system. So,
Partly to fix the system and partly so that you have that information for audit and cost benefit analysis.
okay. Well, thank you. That was great. So you can kind of see some parallels here between it, but the key thing is that it seems training really kind of rises to the surface. You just don't buy something, you try to build, you try to bring users in, and you try to do the training piece. So that's the 2 critical things that come out of these. You got to think about the users, you got to think how getting their opinion and getting buy-in from them, as well as thinking about how it's going to roll out. You're not just going to say, oh, now we have it, use it. You have to actually go through the hard work of training. And what we saw in, I believe, the Australian, no, the, what was it, the Iceland, no, the Australian one, about the shadowing, like a more, not just a single one kind of training, a more kind of pervasive stage training, basically. Okay, so ongoing challenges: usability, simplicity in training, management, commitment, and support, incorporating end users into design and implementation, collaborating with records management, collaborating with IT, Anyone know what organizational concrete is? People hate to change. We're dinosaurs. Organizational concrete, we do it this way. It's locked in concrete. You can't change it. It's frozen. So you have to think about how do you get beyond organizational concrete in organizations.